The M16 was a useless jam, omatic. A common Vietnam War myth holds that the M16 constantly jammed, failed in combat, and cost countless lives. The story started with letters and unit complaints in 1966 to 1967 and moved into congressional hearings before settling into pop culture. Hollywood films and memoirs later treated early problems as inherent design faults. The M16 entered Vietnam as the XM16E1 while still maturing. Early lots lacked chrome-lined chambers and bores, and jungle conditions punished any lapse in maintenance. A key change shifted ammunition from extruded IMR propellant used in trials to ball powder in mass issue, altering pressure curves, increasing fouling, and driving cyclic rates up. Maintenance was initially sold with self-cleaning rhetoric. Cleaning kits were scarce in the first wave, and manuals that codified effective routines did not reach all hands at once. The design was not fundamentally defective. Fielded configuration and ammunition diverged from the tested recipe. Chrome lining, corrected propellant specifications, updated training, and better magazines stabilized performance. Many soldiers adopted small habits that mattered, downloading 20-round magazines to 17 to 18 to avoid feed issues and cleaning at the first lull. The M16A1 that emerged after 1968 was a lighter, controllable rifle that, when maintained and properly fed, ran reliably. The AK-47 was so indestructible GIs commonly swapped to it. This story claims American troops ditched unreliable M16s for unbreakable AK-47s that ran under any conditions. The idea is built on early M16 failures, later retellings in journalism and entertainment. The AK lineage moved from milled AK-47 receivers to the lighter-stamped AKM and Chinese Type 56. The rifles were robust and tolerant of neglect, which impressed opponents. But the operational realities of U.S. units made routine use impractical. Ammunition supply chains fed 5.56 by 45, not 7.62 by 39. Friendly fire risk from the AK's report and tracer signatures discouraged its use near American elements, and regulations generally barred enemy weapons in the line. The reality is, while the AK might be sturdy, it is not magical. It can be fouled and does require maintenance. The M16's worst period was early and was addressed during the war. Many soldiers reported entire tours without rifle malfunctions after the fixes and valued the ability to carry more ammunition for the same weight. Some small units and reconnaissance elements occasionally employed enemy weapons for deniability or particular missions, but this was not standard practice for line infantry. A little-known wrinkle is the sabotage program that compromised some captured ammunition caches, turning battlefield pickups into an additional hazard. The myth spread through compelling photos of one-off pickups and through quotes about the AK's distinctive sound. Films and video games turned exceptional cases into implied norms. Veterans frequently counter those depictions, noting that SOPs, logistics, and identification concerns made AK carriage rare. The AK's brush penetration and simple manual of arms create plausible-sounding arguments, while the M16's later reliability improvements and accuracy are less cinematic. Helicopter door gunners used dual M60s like in movies. The claim imagines door gunners hanging out of Hueys firing an M60 in each hand. It is largely a cinematic creation, later reinforced by reenactments, posters, and misread photographs of paired mounts. The history of the aircraft role points to the M60D, the aircraft-on-vehicle variant of the 7.6 2x51mm. M60 mounted on pintles or bungee-assisted arms. The standard U.S. installation on UH-1s was the M23 armament subsystem, which fed the gun via flexible chutes from box magazines typically on the order of a few hundred rounds per can. Guns were fired from mounts for control, recoil management, and reliable feed. Spare barrels rode in the aircraft because heat generated quickly in sustained bursts. An unloaded M60 weighs over 20 pounds, and belt-fed systems require managed feeds. Firing two at once by hand is implausible and unsafe. Some airframes carried 2 guns per door, or integrated miniguns and other subsystems, but these were mounted systems rather than one gunner hand wielding 2. A lesser-seen fact is that crews sometimes used elastic bungees on mounts to allow a controlled arc, while keeping weight off the gunner's arms. Images and stories diverged from reality because twin mounts and minigun kits can resemble 2 guns per person at a glance, and because staged photographs and museum displays do not always convey how the mounts functioned in the air. Veteran commentary typically flags the telltale's missing skids in photos, trainer cabin layouts, and improbable ammunition claims that suggest static props rather than operational slicks. Flamethrowers were the most common weapon for tunnel rats. The belief associates tunnel clearing with flamethrowers, as if the iconic fire weapon was standard underground. It appears to draw on sensational media and the general association of tunnels with fire and smoke in film. Tunnel warfare was extensive in Vietnam. Tunnel rat teams were selected for size and nerve, and their work emphasized reconnaissance and clearance. The physics of enclosed spaces made flamethrowers untenable below ground. Combustion consumes oxygen rapidly, generates lethal gases, and produces heat that reflects and lingers. Engineers used flamethrowers such as the M1911 above ground to collapse or sanitize structures after infantry had mapped and cleared them. The equipment actually carried underground reflected a different set of priorities. Sidearms like the M1911A1 and .38 special revolvers were common. Suppressed high-standard HDM-22 LR pistols appear in accounts because of low flash and blast, and experimental quiet revolvers with captive piston cartridges existed in small numbers. Grenades, knives, and lights were basic kit. Many tunnel rats reported operating with minimal clothing to pass constrictions and avoid snag hazards, and a seldom mentioned detail, the use of reduced powder loads in some .38 special cartridges to cut blast, an expedient solution for confined fights. Every soldier carried a bayonet. The notion that American troops in Vietnam routinely carried and used bayonets flows from earlier wars and from photos that show bayonets attached during training, ceremonies, or staged shots. A few veteran stories of fixed bayonets in particular incidents became generalized into a picture of regular use. By the 1960s, U.S. doctrine emphasized firepower, airmobile maneuver, and combined arms, which made melee weapons peripheral. Bayonets remained part of issue and training as a tool and as a psychological exercise. In the field, many served as multi-purpose knives to cut vines, pry open crates, or puncture C-ration tins. But organized bayonet combat appears rarely in after-action records. The M7 bayonet fit the M16, and Marines carried robust fighting/utility knives. But stabbing use was uncommon. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units had folding or spike bayonets for AK pattern rifles and SKS carbines, and did employ them in night assaults or last-ditch actions. These were exceptions driven by circumstance and doctrine rather than routine practice. Anecdotes from veterans describe the everyday, mundane uses for bayonets more than combat employment. The myth spread because training rituals and staged images took on a life of their own in media, and because earlier conflicts cast a long cultural shadow. Films and documentaries liked the visual vocabulary of fixed blades in jungle scenes. Soldiers, however, saw bayonets as useful tools and morale props, not mainline fighting implements. A small detail that rarely appears in popular accounts is how often bayonets doubled as makeshift stakes or general field knives rather than being attached to rifles. The M14 was universally hated and replaced immediately. The common shorthand says the M14 failed in the jungle and was dumped almost overnight for the M16. The reality is far more complex. The M14's lineage runs from Garand architecture toward NATO standardization around 7.62 by 51. It offered excellent accuracy and reach as a semi-automatic rifle, with a selective fire provision that proved difficult to control from the shoulder. The cartridge's weight limited ammunition carriage compared with 5.56 by 45. Wooden stocks did not love constant humidity and grime, and long patrols magnified weight penalties. Many soldiers valued the M14 for reliability, range, and penetration in appropriate terrain and roles, while others preferred the lighter, more controllable M16 once reliability issues were solved. The transition did not occur in a single step, and early M16 problems created their own skepticism. Surveys and recollections show variation by unit type and mission. A smaller detail that helps decode impressions is how some units physically restricted the selector to semi-auto, acknowledging what the full power cartridge did to controllability in automatic fire. The myth spread because short explanations travel well. Heavy rifle bad, light rifle good fits a tidy trend line. Reinforced by the visible shift to under 7-pound rifles with higher ammunition loads. Internet discussions and memoirs often present strong single-experience views that drown nuance. The M79 grenade launcher was a primitive stopgap. This claim treats the M79 as an interim, one-shot relic that should have yielded instantly to underbarrel launchers. The break-open design invites that impression, especially when compared to later systems mounted under rifles. The M79 emerged from a push to give small units a controllable explosive round beyond hand grenade distances and without the quirks of rifle grenades. The 40 by 46 mm high-low propulsion concept produced low recoil with useful payloads. The launcher's simplicity, single shot, break open paid dividends in reliability and accuracy in jungles that punished fussy mechanisms. The thing to note is that the M79 filled a genuine capability gap and did so effectively. Grenadiers carried a tailored mix of high explosive, smoke, illumination, and specialized buckshot cartridges. Short engagements often called for a single, accurate projectile rather than a string of fast misses. Practical load carriage mattered. A dedicated vest could carry roughly 18 40mm rounds, with additional ammunition in packs. Another seldom noted detail is how many grenadiers paired the M79 with a sidearm to keep weight manageable. Carrying both a rifle and a grenade launcher as separate long guns was possible, but awkward. Media rarely lingers on how grenadiers actually employed the weapon, which leaves a caricature of old single-shot tube. The persistence of this myth overlooks field reports that emphasize reliability and effect. The M1911 was obsolete by Vietnam. The claim presents the M1911 as a worn-out relic kept by inertia. The image is fed by the visible condition of many pistols rebuilds with mixed parts and Parkerized finishes, and by later moves toward higher capacity 9mm service pistols. Post-WEBU policy stopped whole gun purchases and relied on depot rebuilds, which meant Vietnam-era inventories contained older frames with fresh parts. The pistol's role was secondary in most infantry contexts, which further encouraged the perception that it was an old holdover rather than a living sidearm. But the design remained a durable, reliable tool when maintained and used within its role. It was more than capable of dependable service across conditions. Complaints centered on capacity and the variable condition of issued guns, rather than the platform's fundamental function. Units continued buying replacement parts for decades, and some pistols saw long service lives under depot care. Napalm was the main cause of civilian deaths. This claim elevates napalm to the principal killer of civilians in Vietnam. The image was shaped by anti-war activism, press coverage, and a famous 1972 photograph of children fleeing a strike by a South Vietnamese aircraft, which turned napalm into a global symbol. Strategically, the United States pursued attrition and interdiction against an enemy with external supply routes and sanctuary. Napalm appeared in close air support and denial roles, burning vegetation, attacking fortified positions, and clearing cover not as the dominant tool of area destruction. The bulk of explosive tonnage came from high-explosive bombs, artillery, and cluster munitions. The scale matters. Hundreds of thousands of tons of napalm were used against a backdrop of millions of tons of other munitions across Indochina. The truth is more numerical and doctrinal than anything else. Napalm only accounted for a small fraction of the munitions expenditure, and, by extension, a smaller share of civilian casualties than large-scale high-explosive bombing and artillery fires. The weapon's effects were horrific and visually unmistakable, which made it a powerful symbol. Its area of effect was situational and generally smaller than that of bomber streams that leveled targets with high explosives. A lesser-noted operational point is that pilots and controllers often associated napalm with bunker reduction and thick jungle, not with strikes in dense urban areas. The U.S. lost because the Vietnamese were more resourceful guerrillas. There are those who frame the war as a contest between an industrial superpower and ingenious local fighters who prevailed through superior cunning. It grew in post-war documentaries, Hollywood treatments like Platoon and Apocalypse Now, and anti-war writing that favored a tidy moral arc. Communist propaganda echoed the same theme, presenting peasant audacity as the decisive factor. The conflict sat inside the Cold War, with the United States backing South Vietnam and the North fielding a conventional army, a parallel party apparatus, and an insurgency. Guerrilla methods were adopted out of necessity, not innate superiority. The North lacked the armor and air power for large-scale maneuver until late in the war. American commanders initially treated the campaign as a conventional contest over terrain rather than legitimacy and control of population, and rotation policies hampered unit continuity. Firepower and mobility were not the problem. B-52s, helicopter-borne infantry, napalm, and mechanized assets delivered devastating tactical results. But political constraints shaped how those tools could be used. Rules of engagement aimed to avoid a Chinese or Soviet escalatory spiral. Reliance on body counts as a success metric misread the nature of the struggle, and domestic support eroded as the war lengthened. Casualty asymmetry was severe. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong losses ran into the hundreds of thousands, yet the political contest was not settled by battlefield arithmetic. The weapons that anchor popular imagery, M16A1 rifles, M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, and B-52 delivered ordnance performed as intended at the tactical level. AK-47s and Type 56 rifles became symbols of resilience, although their mythic status owes more to storytelling than unique battlefield properties. A lesser-noted detail is how helicopter logistics enabled operations in terrain that would have been prohibitive without rotary wing lift. While the enemy leveraged an immense human and external supply pipeline through Laos and Cambodia, the brains beat brawn idea spread through films and journalism that favored David and Goliath framing, and through captured footage of tunnels and booby traps. After-action reports rarely support the notion of tactical inferiority. They describe units that usually won engagements but struggled to transform wins into durable control. Veterans often point to political constraints and the weakness of South Vietnamese governance, rather than enemy martial superiority. Comparisons between U.S. attrition strategy and the North's willingness to absorb losses clarify why the claim sounds plausible. The Vietnamese won by simply remaining in the field and outlasting American will, not by outclassing U.S. soldiers in firefights. Thanks for watching. We're genuinely grateful you spent your time here. If this was useful, please consider giving it a like and share friends. And if there's a topic you want covered next, drop your ideas in the comments.